Welcome to Sustainable Building Week San Diego. I'm Lee Eisen, EVP and CEO of AIA San Diego. Today's program, Architecture's Great Divide, is a special presentation from AIA San Diego in conjunction with the San Diego Green Building Council. Special thanks to our friends at SDGBC for inviting us to participate in Sustainable Building Week. A little about AIA San Diego for those of you who may not know us. We are a nonprofit organization and a chapter of the American Institute of Architects, which represents more than 95,000 architects worldwide. AIA San Diego was formed by legendary local architect Irving Gill and others way back in 1928. Then and today, AIA promotes architecture and design excellence in our communities. We support architectural professionals at every step of their careers. When you work with an AIA architect, you know that they have made a commitment to ethics, stewardship, community service, and lifelong learning. Our leaders are also committed to embracing equity, diversity, and inclusion in the profession, serving as citizen architects to improve our communities and advancing progress on sustainability and climate action, which is why we're thrilled to be here today. Today's presentation is led by our colleague, Lance Hosey, who has previously served on AIA San Diego's board of directors. Lance Hosey, who is Chief Impact Officer at HMC Architects, is one of only 30 people in the world to be named a fellow with both the American Institute of Architects and the U.S. Green Building Council. Lance has led the design of many award-winning high-performance projects, and if he wasn't busy enough being an architect, he has written books and published hundreds of essays on sustainable design and is a frequent speaker at renowned venues such as TED, South by Southwest, ECO, the IDEA Festival, and many other events. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Lance Hosey.
To begin talks with a very simple question: what is good design? There's a business thinker named Gary Hamel, whom the Wall Street Journal calls the most important business guru in America today. He says that good design is like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. We know it when we see it. Let me know, MJ, can you see this all right? Is everyone seeing this? I can't tell. Great, terrific. So here's my question. If we can't say clearly what good design is, then how are we meant to practice it? My theory is that we resist pinning down good design with any specificity because we like to reserve creative license for architects to do whatever they want and call it good. This is why we think of architecture as an art. Some of the most famous architects who've ever lived have suggested that architecture is art and nothing else. Fast forward to today, Santiago Calatrava says not only is architecture art, it is the most abstract of all arts, though I'm not sure what that means. So it begs the question, if architecture is art, what exactly is art? And art is one of those elusive terms that hasn't been defined clearly in itself, but the conventional wisdom around it is that at its core, it's really about self-expression. So if architecture is an art, then the architect is an artist, and it's really fundamentally about the self-expression of the architect. Frank Gehry and any number of celebrated architects say exactly this, that it's really about self-expression. This is essentially the message of the Fountainhead, Howard Rourke, that creativity is about serving the creator. So because of this, a few years ago, looks like 6 years ago now, I wrote an article. I had a column in the Huffington Post at the time, and I wrote an article proposing that we shouldn't think of architecture as art and explaining why, essentially the argument I just gave you. And without reading it, a number of people I know reacted very badly to the title alone. A respected design journalist sent me a message on social media saying that the idea that architecture is an art is claptrap. So another friend of mine asked me, well, if architecture, oh, I see my friend just appeared, Kira Gould, who just showed up on camera there, is the person who asked me the thing I was about to tell you. So I don't know, there's something right in the world, which is, if architecture is an art, then what is it? And I think I said something like, well, I don't know that we need to compare it to other fields, but since we tend to think of science as the opposite of art, what would happen if we thought of design first and foremost as a science, meaning that we have a methodology, a series of hypotheses we're trying to test? That sounds more promising to me than thinking of it as art. Over the last few decades, we've learned more and more about the impact of the built environment. If we had a scientific method that we could apply to design to look at how to address these issues, how much more progress would we make? This was the premise behind the AIA Committee on the Environment redefining its top 10 measures for sustainable design. When I joined the Code Advisory Group in 2015, I proposed and led this overhaul that we ended up publishing at the end of 2016. It's really 10 principles to look first and foremost at the impact of design. A few years later, this was adopted institute-wide as the framework for design excellence. So we've gone from an industry that really didn't have a clear definition of design excellence to adopting this around the idea of impact, which is very exciting. On the other hand, it's become the framework for virtually every AIA Design Awards program nationally, regionally, and locally. And I've been on a lot of these awards juries in recent years. We're not really given instructions to say that it's mandatory that people submit this information, and without this information, no one can win an award. So it's huge progress to say that we're defining design excellence around these ideas of impact. On the other hand, it's not necessarily becoming mandatory. If you look at another measure of progress or lack thereof, over the last decade, the AIA has adopted the 2030 commitment, as I'm sure you're all aware, and it sets targets to get to carbon neutrality by that year. And if you look at progress over the last decade, it's fairly slow. Until very recently, the additional energy efficiency with all the work being submitted was about 35%, which is about average for LEED certified buildings. So, and now keep in mind, there are some 20,000 architecture firms in the US and only about 200 of them actually submit this information. So arguably what we're looking at here is the tip of the iceberg with the leading edge of our profession. And the leading edge is doing very slowly around these things. There's a gigantic gap between where we set out to be and where we actually are. Why is that? My theory is because of this thing we're talking about now. We think of sustainability as being about the technical systems. It's about materials, methods, and systems, and not really about design. This is why I titled this talk, Architecture's Great Divide. I stole my own title from another Huffington Post article I wrote a few years ago in response to Aaron Betsky, the critic, who, in response to the top 10 awards that year, he's that have, quote, sustainable credentials but lack other design merits, meaning we shouldn't award buildings for good performance, just for good design. He's very vague on what he means by good design. A decade ago, you may remember Vanity Fair put out an article where they interviewed a little over 50 of the world's leading architects to ask them what the most important buildings of the previous 30 years were. And not one building in that list of about a dozen that got multiple votes had any sort of high performance ambitions. So it led to the impression that the A list in architecture really wasn't interested in sustainability. So to test this, for my column in Architect at the time, I asked the same number of people, but leading green building experts, to say what they thought were the most important buildings of our time that had high performance from the same period, 30 years. And if you look at the two lists, there's not a single American architect on both lists, and there's not a single building on both lists. And the two architects, European architects, Foster and Piano, whose work is associated with decent performance, the work that showed up on the A list was not really high performance because it predates their interest in these things. So what it led to is this idea that there's a fundamental rift between standards of good design and standards of green design. More recently, 5 years ago, to test this, I revisited the G list in Architect and looked at a different way of evaluating this, which is, if we think of the Code Top 10 Award as the premier in excellence for sustainable design, and we think of the AIA National Honor Award as the premier in excellence for general design, how many projects have won both of those awards since Top 10 was introduced in 1997? And at the time, there were this many. I looked recently and still fewer than 10% of the projects that could have won both have won. So I don't think we're anywhere near standards of good and green design coming together. And I believe it's because we perceive architecture to be an art, sustainability to be a science, and never the twain shall meet. E.O. Wilson, the biologist at Harvard, wrote the book Consilience to address this. He says that the idea that there is a difference between the arts and the sciences is a modern conceit. It goes back to Descartes. Before that, we thought of them as the same. And until we reconnect the two, our relationship with the living world will remain problematic. And this is the fundamental premise of my book, The Shape of Green, which came out in 2012. And I believe it's the first book to address the aesthetics of sustainable design. And it asks a basic question: does sustainability change the face of design or only its content? Conventional wisdom about this is pretty clear. When the book came out, there were any number of famous architects who were still dismissing sustainability, saying it had nothing to do with architecture. Raphael Vignoli was my first employer after grad school, has said that sustainability has or should have no relationship to style. It's not just that that we should avoid sustainability influencing what something looks like. Around the same time, at the American Prospect magazine asked whether well-designed green architecture is an oxymoron. It's not just that green architecture is accidentally ugly, it's inevitably ugly for some reason. I think the reason is because there are lots of buildings like this. This was the first LEED Platinum building in the Middle East about 15 years ago. It won an award as the most intelligent building in the world, and it is. If you look at it purely from a systems standpoint, it performs very well. But I think it's safe to say that architecturally it's not terribly inspired, which is why people like Vignoli and Eisenman dismiss the whole agenda, because they think this is what the principles of sustainability produce. Around the time the book came out, I used to show this slide, which is the Honda Civic. They introduced their conventional Civic and their hybrid Civic. And I used to ask audiences, if we were live, I'd ask, can you tell me which is the green car? And people would sort of squint their eyes and try to see the difference, like it's a brain teaser test. But they're exactly the same. The only difference between I think this is 2010, the conventional Civic and the hybrid Civic is the chassis. So performance is hidden under the hood, it's buried in the engine, and that's generally how we approach it in architecture as well. What makes a building smart is the systems, whereas the design can remain somewhat dumb. For 10 years, I drove a smart car import, which at the time, it got better mileage than all the American hybrids just because it's small, round, light, and compact. It's like driving around a big walnut. So I like to say that design trumps technology. And I lived in Charlottesville, Virginia at the time, and I was the first person in Charlottesville to have a smart car. So everywhere I went, people would turn and smile. So I like to think that I'm spreading joy through the land. The book is organized around three kinds of shape: what I call shape for economy or conservation, shape for pleasure or attraction, shape for place or connection. The rest of the talk is going to be organized around these three principles. Starting with conservation, we tend to think of performance, again, as living under the hood. It's in the engine of a building rather than in the chassis. And it's about smart mechanical systems, glazing, insulation, et cetera. But the research shows that up to 90% of the impact of a project is determined by the very earliest design decisions. It's in the napkin sketch, not in the technical manual. Where it's located, how big it is, orientation, massing, fenestration, that can get you far more mileage than choosing smarter mechanical systems. Really good example outside of our industry is if I asked you to design a smarter pot to boil water. That might seem like a daunting task. Pots for boiling water have looked like this forever, right? Several years ago, Lakeland came out with a new flared stream of cookware. And basically what it does is it concentrates the heat on the surface of the pot in order to boil water faster, 40% more faster, just by putting these sort of nodules here. So these ridges lead to a much more high performance pot. And as a result, you also end up with this very interesting thing. It looks the way it does because it works the way it does, and vice versa. And that's the whole idea of this idea of shaping for conservation. Applying that to buildings, Often if I'm in a live audience with architects and I start to show a moment diagram like this, I see people sweating because our architects associate moment diagrams with sleepless nights studying for structures exams in architecture school. So, but really what this is maybe the most common shape in all of construction, a gabled box. And what's interesting about it is the structure itself is pretty simple, but if you look at the physical forces flowing through it, they're fluid, they're dynamic. And the reason is because we try to figure out the worst case scenario that this joist or beam needs to be yay thick at a certain point, and then we just extrude that dimension across the entire length. We do that in every single material. So whether you look at steel, wood, or concrete, that's what we tend to do. We design for the worst case scenario, and then the entire length of the thing, whether it's a column or a beam, is built to that same dimension. So I would estimate that virtually every building you've ever set foot into uses about 40% more material than it needs to in the structure, because we tend to use parts and pieces that are industrially manufactured. So they're mass produced in order to give you a kit of parts to use. So if you need a W6, you'll specify a W6, while you really don't need all that steel. By contrast, Mark West and his students at University of Manitoba for years have experimented with textile textile form work to be able to make concrete in any shape you want, as opposed to this. This is typically how we use concrete. Concrete will take virtually any shape you give it, but we tend to build little boxes, fill it with concrete, and once it sets, we tear away the box, and what's left over is box-shaped concrete. So here's an example of what Mark and his students are doing. It's sewing it with fabric like a dress, so you can put material only where it's needed. So here's the moment diagram for this beam. Here's the actual beam. So as a result, it saves about 50% of the concrete and 300 times the weight and formwork. Plus, it's incredibly beautiful. It's got this very supple porpoise-like shape. Now imagine if every aspect of a building, beams, columns, floors, walls, roofs, had this kind of ingenuity and shaped itself in order to just use the amount of material it needs. Would buildings stop feeling like boxes and cages and maybe feel more like a forest or a skeleton? So this is another way of saying that there is a relationship between form and performance, or image and impact. So one end of the spectrum, some of the most celebrated architects who've ever lived have compelling form without compelling performance. And in fact, what makes the form compelling to architects arguably undermines its ability to perform. You've got a lot of material you don't need. Because of the wacky geometry, it tends to face a lot of different directions, so it gets a lot of heat gain from the sun. At the other end of the spectrum is compelling performance without compelling form. Here's the kind of thing. So imagine this is a net zero or LEED platinum building, but not terribly inspired to occupy or be near, which is why people like Eisenman and Vignoli dismiss these kinds of buildings. The sweet spot in the middle is the idea that performance is driven by the form. An early example of that would be Foster's City Hall in London, which leans into the sun, so it's self-shading on the south side. It leans away from the boardwalk along the Thames in order to bring light down onto the public. It's more transparent on the north than it is on the other sides, and it minimizes the surface area facing the sun. And as a result, it has far less surface than a conventional office building. It gets 75% energy reduction. This was 20 years ago. If you remember the chart I just showed you of the AIA progress, so the cream of the crop of American architects on average are at about 45% energy reduction. 20 years ago, this building was getting to 75 just because it was shaped differently. I like to call this self-sustaining form. Another really interesting example is Sauerbruch Hutton's Bank Tower in Frankfurt. Most of the great examples of this kind of thing are in Europe, not in the US. And it's got a west-facing site, so which means in the afternoon it gets a lot of heat gain from the low sun angle. But what they did is they extruded a retail podium up about 4 stories, and then this airfoil-like tower rises up out of that, minimizes the profile at the hottest time of day, and also this wing shape also tends to encourage wind across the face, which increases passive ventilation. So they're calling it the most energy efficient office building in Europe. A more recent project that I led last year in Austin was for the extension of St. Edward's University campus. Looks like this. It's right on the edge of the freeway there. Here's the river, and then there's Blund Creek runs right through here, and it's a fairly sensitive watershed here. So the idea is how to develop this parcel of land without upsetting the watershed. Austin's in the middle of daylighting all its creeks and streams and creating and making sure that they're being conserved. So this is the existing condition. It's there are parts of it that are fairly bald. The trees aren't growing there. So and then when you also look at what the EPA recommends as a maximum slope for building without upsetting watersheds or having to move trees around, and then you start to map this on. We created a custom script in order to look for that kind of topography, and then identified those places where the slope was less than 5%. If you overlap that with the spaces where there are no trees right now, you start to get this figure that suggests where you could develop sensitively and responsibly. And then when you overlap some standard recommendations for building orientation around the wind and the sun, you start to get this cross grain with those elliptical shapes, which is exactly how the plan was extruded. So the idea, again, is that even at a master plan level, it looks the way it does because it works the way it does. All right, so that was shape for conservation. Shape for attraction is the idea that we can shape things for pleasure, which is obviously something designers have always wanted to do, but it's typically not informed by science. So if the idea is to collapse the divide between art and science, then what can we learn from science about the aesthetics of pleasure? I've often said that what we do for a living as designers is not really much more sophisticated than I like blue, you like purple. How do we resolve that? Well, we can't resolve that if I can't tell you that you should like blue more than purple unless I have some sort of objective criteria for evaluating that. How is this related to what we perceive as sustainability, meaning conservation of resources? It's always been defined much more broadly than that, but it's perceived to be very narrowly around conservation of resources. And it's this, I love this quote from this Senegalese poet saying that in the end, we conserve only what we love, which begs the question, what do we love? People tend to love babies. If you took a Psych 101 course in college, you may be familiar with Conrad Lawrence's work looking at babies and puppies and other things that have round heads and big eyes. There are certain proportions we tend to gravitate towards because we're hardwired to be caretakers for those kinds of proportions. I think that's one of the reasons why people loved watching me drive around in the smart car. It's like driving around in a big baby head. Someone once told me if you want to manipulate your audience, show either a baby or a puppy. So I like to think I'm being doubly manipulative by showing you a baby and a puppy. So puppy is the same thing. People like big heads, round proportions, big eyes. And I think when the VW Beetle, the new one, was introduced 20 years ago, it was called the most smile-inducing car on the road. And I think it's because it has these same proportions. It's a regular size sedan, but it's perceived to be toy-like because it has these proportions. Again, I lived in Charlottesville for a long time, and the University of Virginia did this study because at the time they were curious why, if you look on YouTube, the most watched videos are all the ones that get billions of hits every year tend to be things like puppies falling asleep and kittens falling off sofas and such. And they wanted to know why that was. What they found is they had a controlled study where they showed puppy videos and kitten videos and baby videos to people, and then asked them to do certain tests, mental aptitude tests and tests of motor skills. Had another group that didn't watch the videos of puppies take the same test and found that it relaxed people to see these videos of babies and kittens, and they perform better on these tests. So cuteness improves our skills. So what's the point of that? Do we want all buildings to look like babies and puppies? No. But can we be more informed about what I call the aesthetics of attraction and the mechanics of affection? This is an article I wrote in the New York Times several years ago after my book came out, making this argument that art can be informed by science. Over the last few decades, there's a wealth of research into shape, color, pattern, texture, space, proportions. This is the designer's toolkit. We know more today about the mechanics of all this than we ever have in human history, even though some of the greatest buildings ever designed were driven by these kinds of things. People who are smarter than I am who study aesthetics basically say that beauty is merely a function of mathematical distances and ratios. It's geometry, proportion. These are things that can be systematized easily. It's not magic. Now, a corollary to this is the savanna theory, what I mentioned E.O. Wilson before. If you've heard the term biophilia, which means that we have an innate attraction to other living things, that comes out of this idea of the savanna theory. And the theory is that because the human race lived the first 98% of its evolutionary history in a particular environment, namely the African savanna, before we moved away from that, then of course, everywhere we go, we seek out similar environmental, spatial, and visual cues. So we tend to gravitate towards rolling landscapes with stands of trees, little ponds of water, rather than thick forests or open plains. This is why the open ocean intimidates us. This is why the heartland with giant plains and big sky tends to be intimidating. Now, the most dominant image on the African savanna is the acacia tree, this image here. And lots of studies about why we're drawn to that. It's psychologically, we associate it with sustenance and safety and shade, but also that particular pattern, which is called a natural fractal. Scientists look at this, and a natural fractal is one that is self-similar at every scale. So if you think about a tree, as opposed to a computer-generated, an artificial fractal tends to be identical at every scale. This has a loose similarity at every scale, which I think is the difference between it making it seem kind of stiff and mechanical and making it seem much more pleasurable. Mathematicians classify natural fractals between 1 and 2. 1 is the open Sahara or the ocean. 2 is nighttime or the thick forest. And what they found doing skin conductance tests and tests of heart rates and such is that there is this sweet spot in the middle, a certain proportion of fractals that we tend to enjoy so much that it relaxes us. It can reduce stress by as much as 60% just by being in our field of vision. In 1949, Life magazine called Jackson Pollock the greatest living American painter. And this was when he got to a point where, according to the research, his canvases were instinctively creating these natural fractals. And the theory is he had spent years and years and years flinging drips and drabs of paint on a canvas and instinctively sort of pulled out this evolutionary memory that we all have of preferred patterns. So at the time he was being called the greatest living American painter, he was producing natural fractals without knowing what they are. So one attempt that I've done to apply this kind of research is in a biophilic facade. And the idea that, all right, if we know that these kinds of patterns can reduce stress by being in your field of vision, could we apply them to the workplace and address a fundamental problem of the workplace, which is stress? So now there are lots of things, I'm sure everyone on the call knows that daylight connection, the outdoors, quality views can lower stress and help people feel healthier and happier, more productive, etc. But you can control daylight to some degree. You can't really control the nature of the view. So if you're staring at this, then that feels like magic. If you're staying like this, not so much. So what can you do in the lower case to try to improve what you're staring at? So the idea would be, now if you look at all the research in biophilia, I think if you mention the word biophilia to architects and designers, they immediately think, let's plant some trees and be done with it. But not all trees are created equal. What the research shows is that certain kinds of trees in certain kinds of densities and patterns actually have these effects and others don't. And more importantly, the research all says that you don't need actual trees, you just need the fundamental geometric principles of these kinds of natural patterns. So the trees aren't emitting some sort of invisible pheromone that's making us all happy. It's just aesthetics, it's geometry. So you can imagine abstracting a view like this and using it to do several things on a facade in, say, an office building. You can shade the facade, you can bounce light around, you can frame a view, and also relieve stress. So the team I was working with at the time, we customized a script to look at, could you take any surface, imagine this is an entire facade or just a window, and have this customized script could apply the idea of natural fractals to this without you having to make it up every time. And in some versions of this that we studied, we were able, using these patterns, to get to daylight autonomy just by studying different kinds of densities and patterns on a facade. All right, so that was conservation and abstraction, and I'll end on the idea of shaping for a particular place. Now, I often hear that design should mimic nature, and there are lots of reasons for that, which suggests that we should understand nature better. If you look into nature, you get this seemingly endless variety of hills and haddocks and streams and beaches. So there's an incredible richness in nature, and what we tend to give back to it increasingly feels pretty generic. In a way that I literally Googled McMansion and this is what I got. I have no idea where this is, so literally. So architects are fond of dismissing fast food franchises such as McDonald's for building the same building everywhere, but then we give awards to Frank Gehry for doing exactly the same thing. What's the challenge with that? I think we tend to reward architects who have this consistent style in their work because we think architecture is an art. We need recognizable vocabulary and the artist's body of work. But as I like to say, the signature style is the single biggest obstacle to sustainable performance. If you know ahead of time what a building is going to look and feel like simply because that's what you do every time out of the gate, then you rob it of an opportunity to be tailored to the unique circumstances of the people in place you're serving. So if you apply this to San Diego I've only been in San Diego off and on for about 5 years, and I love San Diego. I think it has one of the most beautiful natural settings ever, but it also is struggling to find a kind of architecture that is tailored to this place. I mean, what makes an image like this feel like San Diego is largely the quality of water and sky. When you frame just the buildings, you're if you showed this to anyone in the world, I'm not sure they'd know where they are. This is why a few years ago I wrote an op-ed in the Union Tribune saying that, I'm sure you're all familiar with the San Diego skyline is called the toolkit, and I was suggesting maybe it's time to retool the skyline. So a lot of famous architects have built in San Diego, and they built exactly what they build everywhere else. Here's Helmut Jahn in San Diego, Illinois, and they liked it so much in Philadelphia, he gave them 2 of them. Here's Richard Meyer in San Diego, Atlanta, and Barcelona. There's a similar fascination with material types and colors and proportions, etc. This is clearly driven by what fascinates Helmut Jahn and Richard Meyer, and not by the unique circumstances of this climate and this community. By contrast, Schindler, his Level House in LA, a lot of his work looked like this because everyone's work looked like this at the time, the sort of European modernism. This was the precursor to Richard Meyer. But the project he did in La Jolla fascinates me because it's an application of modernism to local materials in a way that feels very of San Diego, and I love that. It's one of the rare examples of a world-famous architect adapting to the unique circumstances of the place. So I'm fond of saying, I think that what we're taught in architecture school about what drives good design, much of it needs to be turned upside down if we're to address the unique challenges of today. We are taught that form follows function, and when Louis Sullivan said that, what he meant is that by function he meant programmatic use. So an office building should look like an office building should look like an office building because they all function in the same way. But if you look at indigenous and vernacular building traditions, it's the opposite. Form does not follow function. If you look at Virginia dog trot versus a New England colonial, it's the exact same function. It's a single family house. And yet they have very different forms because of climate. The dog trot is low, spread out, big hole in the middle in order to promote breezes because the controlling condition is that it's hot and humid in summer. New England colonial is the opposite. It's compact because it gets really cold in winter, so they try to keep the windows small, conserve the heat in the middle. So the surface to volume ratio between these two is very, very different. So this is the opposite of what we're taught is good architecture. So in many ways, if we're to address the challenges of contemporary architecture, we need to unlearn everything we've learned and rediscover these hidden histories that were not the drivers when we were in school. So I like to say that there's a fundamental connection between people, purpose, and place. All these things are different with every single project, so therefore design should be different. A recent project that we're working on is for the Honeybee Discovery Center north of Sacramento. And their mission is to teach the importance of pollinators, especially honeybees, in our environment. So it's, I don't know if you're aware of this, but that part of Northern California is almond country, and almonds are naturally pollinated by honeybees. So there's this interesting relationship, reciprocal relationship between the honeybees and the almond trees. We went into this with the conceit that the building could learn from bees. I won't belabor all of this, but a honeycomb is a very, very efficient structure with materials. We also learned that the inside of a beehive with thousands of bees flitting around, you'd think it would get very hot, but bees' wings move at about 250 times a second, and that movement, which I'll show you in a video clip, tends to eject heat out of the hive. So they're passively ventilating the hive just by doing their work. Are also very efficient with material. The bee's wing is shaped in this funny way because there's something called critical crack length. So all of this is basically naturally where the vein should go so that this tissue-like material will not sever. So the wings are incredibly light and seemingly fragile if it weren't for these veins. So it's like flapping around on Kleenex. And then finally, color is interesting because bees tend to be drawn to a certain range of the visible spectrum. And but also that is a very smart color if you think about it for a building in a hot climate, because too dark would absorb too much heat, too light would reflect too much heat. So yellow is right in this middle of the range where a building could be very smart. So I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing we're learning from is Orland is a very agro-industrial town. It's basically a sleepy farm town. A lot of buildings like this. What can we learn from agricultural buildings that where the plan is incredibly simple, the materials are really cost effective, and then the roof tends to vary depending on the needs of what's going on underneath it. So the idea that we can learn from bees and from farm structures in one building is what drove this. So the idea that you get these roof shapes that are uniquely tailored to the circumstances of whatever's going on under that or around that is what became the driver for this building. So you can see here that this is basically just a big shed that has this honey color. One of my colleague of mine who did these renderings said it's like a Winnie the Pooh nightmare. And I said, oh, let's make it a Winnie the Pooh, dream. So, but the idea is that it's a big indoor-outdoor shed that is very much like the architecture of the place, but it has this color partly to give it a brand, but also, as I said, that color is very smart for this climate. So it's a big shed where most of the communal space is not heated and cooled artificially, and then it's got enclosed spaces for exhibits and other functions. You arrive at the south side. It's mostly they cater to school kids. So big buses come in, drop people off. And there's this hovering rooftop pollinator garden here. They were very concerned about, they wanted to show off honeybees pollinating, but they also didn't want the kids to be too near the bees because, they're worried about stings and allergies, et cetera. So lifting it up on this sort of stage set. So you move into the place by moving under the pollinator garden. And then when you move into the entry foyer here, what you see on the left is a giant, in their current temporary exhibit, they have what they call a honey vault, which is they sell and show off local honey. We like the idea of the west facade being this sort of, inventory of huge jars of local honey so that when the afternoon light comes through it, it spills a sort of soft amber glow into the foyer. But also we're working with Integral Group on this, and they pointed out the honey is an incredible insulator. So this is an early sketch, but we're looking at making this a sandwich facade with all these honey jars to insulate the west facade. On the opposite face, we get this sort of display showing the history of Orland. and beekeeping here. And then ahead is a silo theater where you get a sort of introduction. And then above you is hovering this observation hive. So it's just under the pollinator garden here. So as you move in, the bees crawl down from the pollinator garden into this hive here, and you can imagine a group of kids hovering under it and looking up at the bees. You move into this space, that's the honey wall. And this is an observation area from upstairs. We're still working on this. This is an early rendering that looks a little like a coffee can, unfortunately, but the idea is that you move into this silo-like theater and you get an introductory film about all this. Here's a live almond tree actually in the space. And then the clear story above is meant to eject heat, which I'll come back to in a second. Everywhere throughout, you get little glimpses of the surroundings. There's a water tower that says Orland on it that is the thing that's most memorable about downtown. So we wanted to make sure that we're constantly giving you glimpses of the surroundings. Once you get upstairs, you get this dormer window that gives you a little glimpse of the pollinator garden outside. And then the top of the silo theater is actually a live video feed showing the bees outside in the garden at about 5 times actual scale. So little kids could be staring at a bee that's the same size as them. And then outside in the most kind of pedestrian heavy area it's meant to seem like a big barn with a sign advertising itself. Here's a sketch that Integral Group put together looking at passive ventilation. There's a really interesting strategy that they're recommending to hang what they're calling a solar absorber, which is essentially just a sheet of rippled metal under a skylight. It heats up, and as it heats up, it encourages heat to rise and get ejected through here. So we're comparing that to the inside of a beehive with the idea of bees flapping wings and moving heat out of the space. We also have this conceit of hanging a sign in the space that says no bees were harmed in the making of this building. This is pursuing LEED Platinum Net Zero and Living Building Challenge, so wish us luck. And then finally, I'm going to end on this, that a couple weeks ago, we had a project in the New York Times for a concept for a zero carbon community in Lagos. Lagos is plagued with overpopulation and a housing crisis. It's also been decimated by COVID-19. And it's threatened with all kinds of environmental degradation. So the idea is, how can you address the housing crisis and the public health crisis while also addressing climate change? Without getting into the specifics of this, one of the things that really fascinates me is that HMC did some research last fall that we published that you can find on our website that about the vicious cycle between climate change and COVID. So there's more and more research that suggests that COVID-19 is creating, because it's upsetting natural biodiversity, it's paving the way for novel viruses such as COVID to come into being. So the prediction is that there are going to be more viruses like this. So there is a connection between climate change and COVID, and yet one of the standard recommendations for how you address physical distancing in buildings is to get decreased density, meaning buildings get larger. So the research we did is to show that if you take the standard 6-foot physical distancing recommendation and apply it to every commercial building in America, then the building stock would grow by about 11%. Without significantly reducing energy consumption, that additional 11% would be like putting 27 million extra cars on the road. So basically, we're creating this vicious cycle of climate change is creating a public health crisis. To address the public health crisis, we're exacerbating climate change. So anything we do to address the public health crisis also has to be a climate strategy. So this is the concept as featured in the New York Times. Lagos is in a really interesting place in Nigeria. Over here, most of the very dense development is over here on the west bank of the lagoon. There's a huge forest zone over here, and then the Lekki Peninsula here is being conceived as a development called blue-green. So it has very high aspirations for sustainability. It's pretty sparsely populated, but there are parts of the lagoon here that feel like this. So you can see that people were just sort of creating their own housing floating in the water because there's a lack of available housing otherwise. Now, we've done our research and found that, so this is what a young Nigerian developer reached out to me because he saw an article I wrote about some of the things I just described to you. And we've done a research, and actually this part of Lagos is not predicted to be underwater as a result of sea level rise, but it tends to flood very badly. Nigeria gets something like 70 inches of rainfall annually because of the monsoon season. This is our site. You can see that where it tends to pond during flooding season. So the idea is that how do we manage these areas with water responsibly by putting a development here? And the thought is that we can knit a development in here while creating urban space that collects water. So when during the dry season, this might be an open sort of green area, but during the wet season, all the water moves to these sort of public spaces. So you can get pretty heavy rainfall without it flooding your streets or buildings. And the whole thing is organized around optimal soil orientation, pretty dense in most parts, while also having these relief valves of these sort of green urban lungs. And then the breezes come through here because the coast, it gets pretty great breezes through here for a tropical climate because the ocean is to the south and the lagoon is to the north. And then this is how it lays out in terms of mixed uses. This area in the middle here is what I'm about to show you. So traditionally the pre-colonial peoples, and still the most dominant ethnic group in Lagos, is the Yoruba. And the Yoruba word for street is Opopona. So we conceive this sort of large urban thoroughfare as being sort of like La Rambla in Barcelona, where you have pretty dense development on either side with a very wide medium that's lushly vegetated down the center. And this is also heavily influenced by a lot of Nigerian pre-colonial planning. Pre-colonial planning. So it's a lot of grid and a lot of courtyards, very heavy with geometry, but also using a lot of earthen materials and thatch and such. Along the Apopona down the middle is a series of event pavilions. This one's an amphitheater that might have a bar underneath, which looking at this sort of thing with maybe local artists doing the undersides of these. So as you come upon this from a distance, it might look like a traditional structure, but as you come upon it, it's this opportunity to show off local artists. A lot of what's happening here on the facade, to shade the facade, is based on traditional Yoruba decorative patterns like these. You get a lot of diagonal grids. Here's a lot of what you see in Nigeria during the pre-colonial developments, a lot of earthen structures, a lot of thatch. It's because mud is plentiful and it also can get hot and sticky. So how do you move breezes through it? Keep an eye on that. So the housing courts is kind of loosely based on this idea. Deep relief to get lots of shade, but lots of social spaces and places for water to collect during the wet season. And then in the urban lungs that I mentioned, there are places that it's terraced along the edges, so it could this could get completely flooded with water, but then recede and still be a pretty decent urban plaza. The conceit of these pavilions is a place to gather and get out of the shade, but also wooden flutes are traditional to the area, and the idea that you have these different dowels of different lengths and diameters that have holes in them, so as the breezes move through them, they would play harmonic music. All right, I'll end on this slide. So as I mentioned before, we tend to think of, there's certain traditions in architecture that influence how we build. And I don't think I've ever read this in a history of architecture, but if you think about it, if you read any survey of world architecture, it tends to focus on Europe and America, and it tends to focus on sacred space. Before the Renaissance, virtually everything that you see in these history books is sacred space because that's all that really exists: temples, mausoleums, cathedrals, etc. Now, in the Western tradition, in most faith systems, the sacred space is seen as a place apart. Think about the Parthenon. It's perched in the Acropolis. It's meant to be seen as separate from everyday life. It's an arduous journey to get up there, and once you get up there, you're not even allowed inside because only the priests were allowed inside. Also, there's an incredible book called Socrates' Ancestor that says that the peristyle Doric temple evolved around the idea of oars and wings. So the columns are meant to seem as if the building could take flight any minute. Fast forward to today, that's exactly what Calatrava's work does. It's as if it's literally taking flight. So contemporary architecture, I mean, when we're age 18 or something and we go into architecture school and learn that great architecture is separate from everyday reality, and then we're shocked that contemporary architects, when given the most coveted commissions, create monuments that seem separate from everyday reality. As I mentioned before, there's this whole hidden history with indigenous and vernacular structures that are the opposite. If you squint your eyes, these places, the buildings and lands seem to merge because they didn't have the ability to move precious stones or other materials at vast distances, so they had to use the materials right in front of them. So if we are to address the challenges of today, what would it mean to unlearn the history of architecture and rediscover these kinds of patterns to address new challenges? Thank you. All right, how are we doing on time? We're right at the hour, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you for a great presentation. I also have Lee here.
Hello.
Hi there. Thanks a lot, Lance. That was absolutely riveting. It's really inspiring to reference nature and our proclivities to experience joy or pleasure or comfort from certain images and patterns and colors, and then thinking about green design in a whole new light as an integral element of aesthetic beauty and emotion and form and function. That was wonderful. So thank you. In case any of you joined late or missed our introduction to Lance's presentation, it's brought to you by AIA San Diego as part of the San Diego Green Building Council's Sustainable Building Week. So as Lance noted, we'd like to open it up to Q&A, and I also do want to make sure that Bridget Rickman, if she would like, has a chance to make any announcements about the overall Sustainable Building Week program that the SDGBC has going on. And then last but not least, I'd like to note that one of our partner firms, Miller Hull, has a decarbonization presentation tomorrow at 11 a.m. So if you haven't registered for that and you might be interested, go to the San Diego Green Building Council Sustainable Building Week website and find that there. So yeah, let's open it up to Q&A. Thanks again, Lance.
This is Fred Marks, and I have a couple of comments. One, instead of there being 26 people, there should have been 226 people. So thank you for a provocative presentation, Lance. Number two, where do you think we'll be 5-10 years from now in terms of the graphs that you were showing us early on, as far as the profession catching up to its responsibility?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I would like to be hopeful because I think that even in spite of designers' tendency not to think of these things first and foremost, I think that building systems are getting smarter and smarter and more affordable. And it's only a matter of time before we can't even avoid buildings getting smarter in terms of performance, even despite our habits. So it'll be curious to see where things go. There is still a lingering question that, let's say, if the entire utility grid goes green, if everything is renewably powered, does that relieve architects of the responsibility to design better buildings? I'd still like to think that we can be much more responsible with how we design buildings, even if the sources of energy that we're using are 100% renewable, because I think that's an example of how we tend to think of sustainability as purely about conservation of resources rather than a broader range of issues.
Right. Well, Lance, you may not know, my connection beyond traditional architecture is associated with the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture.
Yep.
And I appreciated your comments about the nexus between art and science. And if it's not a matter of architects being completely accountable within their palette of design to reach sustainable conclusions, I'm hoping that they'll better understand that it's about the people that they're designing for inside the building, and that will be equally a greater connection between art and science in the future.
Mhm. Yeah, I mentioned Kira Gould earlier. Now she's still on, but Kira and I co-wrote a book in 2007 called Women in Green. I know the SDGBC has a Women in Green committee. That all came out of the USGBC's initiatives around Women in Green. As a result of the 2006 event, we did a green build around that topic. The reason I mention is for the research on our book, the earliest example we could find of the use of the word sustainability with the connotations that it has now was in the 1972 book Limits to Growth, Dana Meadows. And in that book, she says something like, she uses it essentially with a triple bottom line, that it's really about social, economic, and environmental value. If you fast forward to the Brundtland Report in 1987, it's the same thing. It's about poverty eradication, and it's really about equity in communities. And yet, when we say the word now, one of the things that irks me most is when I see headlines that say things like wellness is the new green. No, it's the old green. You just forgot or never knew because you've been taught that it's about energy and materials or something. It's always been part of this. We have to think of I mean, essentially, if it is social, economic, and environmental value, I'm going to climb up on a soapbox for a minute, so sorry about that. So I can think of nothing of value that doesn't fall into that spectrum. If I asked everyone in this call to say what they value most, they'd probably say family, friendship, love. Those are social values. So with sustainability is everything, I often hear from our peers that their clients don't care about sustainability. Well, if sustainability is everything and your clients don't care about it, then you think your clients don't care about anything. Well, that's not true. They care about something. We just portray sustainability as if it's separate from what they care about. We have to shift the burden away from clients to be particularly enlightened about these issues and stop trying to twist their arms to care about climate or something, and instead put the burden on us to be smarter about how we deliver value in ways that are also addressing the things we associate with sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be fundamentally about humanity, because if you know, it's been said by much smarter people than I that if climate change does its worst and we cease to exist, eventually nature's going to bounce back and it will be fine. So if we're not watching out for ourselves, something tragic's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that sounded really dark. I meant it to be uplifting. Sustainability is great. Yay. It's about the people.
Very good.
Very, very good. Thank you. I said something really dark and tragic and complimented me. Thank you.
I think that appeals to Fred Marks' sense of humor.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions for Lance since we have him here? Okay. Bridget, did you want to make any announcements?
Yeah.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks for that opportunity. Thank you, MJ and Lee, for putting this together, and Lance for that presentation. It was really wonderful. I always love hearing what HMC is working on. They won quite a few of our sustainable design and sustainable building awards this year, so always great work to recognize.
8? We won 8 of them by my count, but you know, who's got
very impressive. I did want to, Lee mentioned that Miller Hull is hosting a session tomorrow. We do also have SD NOMA, the newly formed chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects, is hosting a session at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and the American Association of Landscape Architects San Diego chapter is hosting a session tomorrow as well. So a lot of San Diego action happening on our final day of Sustainable Building Week. I'm going to put the link in the chat if anyone wants to sign up. All those events are free. And just thank you again to AIA San Diego for being a great partner and putting this on. I really appreciate it. And to Lance for that great presentation. Thank you all.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. This was great. Yeah, definitely check out all of those programs. Thank you, Bridget. I didn't know about the NOMA presentation or the ASLA presentation, so that's very exciting. Lots happening still tomorrow. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and join us again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.